What would you risk for a stranger whose name you barely knew? David Chen stared at 3 sentences in a church bulletin, words printed in plain black ink on cheap paper. A simple prayer request. Rebecca Martinez needs a kidney transplant. Her health is declining. If you feel led to explore living donation, please contact the church office. His hands went cold. The paper trembled between his fingers. He'd been attending First Community Church for exactly 23 Sundays, sitting in the back row, leaving before coffee hour. He'd never spoken to Rebecca Martinez, but something in those printed words made his chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. Rebecca Martinez had taught 3rd grade for 12 years before her body betrayed her. She was 38, divorced but on good terms with her ex-husband Tom for the sake of their kids. Emma was 12, Lucas 8. Rebecca led the Sunday school for kindergartners, baked chocolate chip cookies that disappeared within minutes at church potlucks, and took her children hiking every Saturday morning when the trails were still empty and the air smelled like pine. That was before the routine physical that revealed elevated creatinine levels, before the follow-up appointments with the nephrologist whose office smelled like hand sanitizer, and whose measured words carried unavoidable truth, before the diagnosis that arrived 3 months later like a door slamming shut. Stage 5 kidney failure. Both kidneys. You'll need dialysis, the doctor said, and eventually a transplant. The dialysis chair became Rebecca's second home. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 4 hours each session. The chair was cracked vinyl, always too cold no matter how many thin blankets the nurses piled on top of her. The machine beside her whooshed and beeped in steady rhythm, pulling her blood out through a needle in her arm, cleaning it, pushing it back in. The fistula they'd created in her forearm for the dialysis access left permanent bruising, a roadmap of purple and yellow that never quite faded. She had to resign from teaching mid-semester. Standing for full days became impossible. The exhaustion crept through her like fog, thick and suffocating. Emma started having anxiety attacks, crying at night because Mom looked so tired all the time. Lucas tried to be brave, making her drawings of superheroes with the word MOM written across their chests in crayon. Tom helped when he could, but he had his own family now. A new wife and a baby on the way. The transplant coordinator explained the waiting list during Rebecca's 2nd month on the machine. 7 to 10 years for a deceased donor organ. Maybe longer. Rebecca's hands shook as she signed the paperwork. She might not have 7 years. The church rallied. The women's ministry organized meal trains. Different families brought casseroles and lasagnas and roasted chickens, 3 nights a week. Members volunteered to drive Rebecca to her dialysis appointments when she couldn't manage it herself anymore. The church took up a special offering to help with medical bills that insurance refused to cover. Rebecca accepted the help because she had no choice, but every act of kindness felt like a debt she could never repay. 15 months into treatment, she stopped feeling like herself. Her skin took on a grayish tone. Her hair thinned. She attended church on Sundays because faith was the one thing she had left to cling to. But worship felt different now. The songs about God's provision rang hollow when she could barely make it through a week without collapsing. Lifting her hands during worship required energy she didn't have. Pastor Mike knew her situation was desperate. One Sunday morning in October, he made a decision without asking Rebecca first. He included a brief request in the church bulletin, the kind of thing most people skimmed over while waiting for the service to start. Please lift up Rebecca Martinez as she awaits a kidney transplant. Her health is declining. If you feel led to explore living donation, please contact the church office. 3 sentences, 27 words. They would change 2 lives. David Chen read those words, sitting in his usual spot in the back row. The sanctuary was half full, people chatting in low tones, the worship team tuning guitars on stage. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the bulletin in his lap. He read the request once, then again. His throat tightened. He couldn't explain what happened next. It wasn't an audible prompt, wasn't a vision, just a knowing, deep in his chest, that pressed down like a hand on his sternum. He sat through the entire service, not hearing a single word of the sermon. The bulletin stayed open in his lap, his thumb running over those 3 sentences, until the paper felt soft with wear. David Chen was 42, an accountant who'd moved to this city 18 months ago for work. He was a widower. His wife Karen had died of cancer 3 years earlier, a slow death that hollowed him out from the inside. They'd never had children. Most of his family lived overseas in Taiwan. He'd moved here to escape the memories, to start over in a place where everything didn't remind him of what he'd lost. He'd started attending First Community Church because the building was 3 blocks from his apartment, and because Sunday mornings felt too empty otherwise. He sat in the back row, left before coffee hour, spoke to almost no one. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. That night, he sat at his kitchen table until 2 in the morning. The church bulletin lay spread flat in front of him, the edges curling slightly. A single lamp hung over the table, casting a circle of yellow light. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, leaving a ring stain on the wood. The clock on the stove glowed 2:17 a.m. Outside, the street was silent except for the occasional car passing, headlights sweeping across his walls. Karen's words played in his memory, something she'd said during one of their last conversations, before she got too sick to talk much. When you know what's right, you do it. No excuses. She'd been talking about her decision to stop treatment, to enter hospice, to die with dignity instead of prolonging the inevitable. But the words stuck with him now, 3 years later, sitting at his kitchen table with a stranger's need in front of him. Monday morning, he called the church office. The receptionist sounded surprised when he explained why he was calling. "You want to be tested as a living donor? For Rebecca Martinez?" "Yes," he said. "How do I start?" She gave him the number for the transplant center at University Hospital. No one else had called, she told him. He was the first. The initial blood work took 15 minutes. David sat in a chair at the hospital lab, watched the phlebotomist tie the rubber tourniquet around his arm, felt the needle slide into his vein. He was O negative, the nurse told him when the results came back. Universal donor. That's good. Rebecca Martinez was O positive, compatible. They'd need to run more tests. Rebecca didn't know a potential donor was being evaluated. Hospital policy protected donor identity until both parties agreed to meet. She continued her routine, 3 times a week, 4 hours each session. Her body was shutting down in slow motion. She'd lost 20 pounds. Her daughter Emma had started cooking dinner most nights, following recipes from the internet, her hands shaking as she chopped vegetables. David underwent 6 weeks of testing, physical exams, psychological evaluations, meetings with financial counselors who made sure he understood the risks and costs. His boss at the accounting firm started asking questions about why he was taking so much time off work. His sister in Taiwan called him on a Sunday afternoon, her tone tight with worry. "You're doing what? For someone you don't even know?" David stood in his kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, struggling to find words. "I can't explain it," he said finally. "It just feels like the right thing to do." The transplant coordinator called him on a Tuesday in November, 6 weeks after his first blood test. David had just gotten home from work, was loosening his tie when his phone rang. The coordinator's tone was measured, professional. "Mr. Chen, we have your results. You're approved. Not just compatible, you're a perfect match." 6 out of 6 HLA markers. Do you know how rare that is? Most living donors match 3 or 4 markers. You and Rebecca Martinez are as close as siblings. David sat down on his couch. Sunlight came through the blinds, making stripes across his carpet. He thought of Karen. Thought of the 3 years since her death, years that felt like wandering in fog. He thought of those 3 sentences in the church bulletin, the inexplicable conviction that had gripped him that Sunday morning. "When can we schedule it?" he asked. 18 months after her diagnosis, Rebecca got the call. She was at home, folding laundry in the living room, while Emma did homework at the kitchen table. The transplant coordinator sounded warm, almost excited. "Mrs. Martinez, we have a living donor. You're scheduled in 3 weeks." Rebecca's hands went slack. The shirt she'd been folding dropped to the floor. Her knees buckled. She sank down slowly, back against the couch, phone still pressed to her ear. Emma looked up from her homework, eyes wide. "Mom? Mom? What's wrong?" Rebecca couldn't speak. Tears blurred her vision. Emma ran over, knelt beside her, gripped her shoulders. The coordinator was still talking, explaining pre-op protocols, asking if Rebecca had questions. "Who is it?" Rebecca managed to whisper. "Who's donating?" The coordinator hesitated. "The donor has chosen to remain anonymous until after. Both of you will have the option to meet once you've recovered. If you both agree, do you agree to proceed?" "Yes," Rebecca said. Her words broke. Yes. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of final appointments and last dialysis sessions, and Emma and Lucas asking questions Rebecca couldn't answer. "Who would do this for you, Mom?" Lucas asked one night at dinner. "Someone from church," she said. "I don't know who, but God knows." She said it with more confidence than she felt. The day arrived on a Thursday in early December. Pre-dawn light barely touched the sky when Rebecca reached the hospital. Pastor Mike met her in the pre-op bay, the space divided by fabric curtains that created the illusion of privacy. She lay on the gurney in a stiff hospital gown, an IV line already threaded into her arm. Cold saline dripped into her vein. Pastor Mike held her hand and offered words about provision and healing and trust. Rebecca closed her eyes and tried to believe. In another operating room, David Chen was being prepped at the same time. His organ would be harvested laparoscopically, 3 small incisions instead of 1 large cut. Recovery would be faster that way. He lay on his own gurney, surgical cap already on his head, listening to the anesthesiologist explain what would happen next. "You'll count backward from 10, she said. "You won't remember anything after about 7. David nodded. He thought of Karen one last time, thought of those 3 sentences in the bulletin, started counting. The procedures happened simultaneously in adjacent operating rooms. David's organ was removed first, transported immediately to Rebecca's surgical team. It was healthy, pink, perfect. Within minutes of being transplanted into Rebecca's abdomen, it began producing urine. The surgical team celebrated with muted relief, a collective exhale. It was working. Rebecca woke in recovery with a new organ inside her and a pain in her side that felt both sharp and distant, dulled by morphine. A nurse leaned over her, smiling. "You did great," she said. "It's functioning beautifully. You're going to be okay." Rebecca tried to smile back, but her face felt heavy. She drifted to sleep. David woke in his own recovery room, groggy and nauseous. His side burned where they'd made the incisions. A different nurse checked his vitals, adjusted his IV. "You're a hero," she told him. "That organ is already working in your recipient." David closed his eyes. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who'd finally done something right after 3 years of nothing mattering. Post-op day 2, Both were stable enough for the introduction. The transplant coordinator arranged it in Rebecca's room. She'd been moved out of ICU, was sitting up in bed when the knock came. "Come in," she called. The door opened. A slight man walked in carefully, favoring his left side where bandages showed beneath his hospital gown. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, solemn eyes. He looked familiar. Rebecca stared. "You're from church. You sit in the back." David nodded. "I read about you in the Bulletin." The silence stretched between them, heavy with something neither knew how to name. "Why?" Rebecca asked finally. Her throat felt tight. "You don't even know me." David stood there, one hand braced against the doorframe for support. "I don't know," he said softly, "but it felt like the right thing to do." Rebecca's throat closed. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. She tried to speak, but no words came. David walked slowly to the chair beside her bed, lowered himself into it with a grimace. They sat in silence, the only sound, the steady beep of her monitors, and the wheeze of the IV pump. Finally, Rebecca found her words. "I can never repay you for this." David shook his head. "I'm not asking you to." They talked for 20 minutes before the nurse came to check vitals and shooed David back to his room. Rebecca learned he was a widower, that he'd lost his wife 3 years ago, that he'd moved here to start over and hadn't done a very good job of it, that he didn't know why he'd felt compelled to donate, except that reading her name in the Bulletin had felt like being grabbed by the shoulder and turned in a specific direction. "I'm not a particularly religious person," he said. "But I couldn't ignore it," Rebecca nodded. "Sometimes God speaks in the smallest ways," she said. "Maybe this was loud enough for both of us." Recovery was slow, but steady. Rebecca's new organ functioned at 85% capacity, better than many people's birth organs. The transplant coordinator called it miraculous. Rebecca called it grace she didn't deserve. David's body adjusted to functioning with one, without complications. His incisions healed clean. He was discharged after 4 days. Rebecca stayed a week. When she finally went home, Emma and Lucas had made a banner that hung across the living room. "Welcome home, Mom." Lucas had drawn smiling kidneys on it, complete with stick arms and legs. Emma had baked a cake that was slightly lopsided, but covered in pink frosting. Tom was there too, holding his new baby daughter, tears in his eyes when he hugged Rebecca. "I know we're not together anymore," he said, words catching, "but I never stopped caring." She hugged him back, felt his shoulders shake. "Thank you for being here," she whispered. 6 weeks after the procedure, Rebecca returned to teaching part-time. Just mornings at first. The principal had held her position, shuffled schedules to make room for her again. Her third graders made her cards with crayon drawings of hearts and stars. "Welcome back, Miss Martinez. We missed you." She stood at the front of the classroom that first day, looking at their small faces, and had to stop for a moment to collect herself. The color was back in her skin. Her hair was growing thicker. She had energy again, real energy, not the fake version she'd been running on for months. David kept attending First Community Church, still sitting in the back row, but now Rebecca's family sat with him. It started the second Sunday after they were both back. Rebecca had walked in with Emma and Lucas, spotted David sitting alone, and without thinking twice, led her kids down the aisle to his row. "Mind if we sit here?" she asked. David looked up, surprised. "Please," he said. Lucas immediately started showing him a Pokemon card collection. Emma asked him questions about accounting. By the time worship started, David was smiling in a way he hadn't smiled in 3 years. It became a routine. Every Sunday, Rebecca's family sat with David. After service, they'd go to coffee hour together, David balancing a paper plate of donuts while Lucas chattered about school. Other church members started approaching them, asking about the transplant, calling it a miracle. David deflected the recognition, uncomfortable with being called a hero, but Rebecca wouldn't let him hide. "This man gave me my life back," she'd tell anyone who asked. "He's family now." 3 months after the procedure, Rebecca took Emma and Lucas hiking for the first time in 2 years. The trail was one they'd loved before her illness, a 5-mile loop through pine forest with a waterfall at the halfway point. She dreamed about it during dialysis, promised herself that if she ever got a transplant, this hike would be the first thing she'd do. They went on a Saturday morning, the air cold and clean, sunlight filtering through branches overhead. Rebecca's legs were weak at first, unused to the exertion, but with each step she felt stronger. At the waterfall, she stood at the edge and let the mist settle on her face. Emma and Lucas splashed in the shallow pool below, their laughter echoing off the rocks. Rebecca closed her eyes and breathed deep. 6 months after the procedure, the church asked Rebecca and David to speak at a testimony service. They stood together at the front of the sanctuary, both nervous, both struggling to find adequate words. The pews were full, faces turned toward them expectantly. Rebecca spoke first, her hands gripping the podium to keep them from shaking. "I spent 18 months on dialysis," she said, "waiting for a miracle I wasn't sure would come. I accepted help until accepting help felt like suffocating under the weight of kindness. And then one Sunday, someone I'd never met read 3 sentences in a bulletin and decided to give me an organ." She looked at David. "I learned that sometimes we're rescued by people we never saw coming." David's turn. He gripped the podium, knuckles white against the dark wood. "I lost my wife 3 years ago," he said. His words were soft but steady. "I moved here to start over, but I didn't know how. I felt purposeless. Empty. Then I read about Rebecca in the Bulletin, and something happened inside me. I can't explain it. It just felt like the right thing to do." He paused, swallowed hard. "Sometimes giving your life to a stranger brings your own life back. I gave Rebecca an organ, but what she gave me was worth more." He glanced at her. "She gave me a reason to keep going." The sanctuary was silent, except for the sound of people crying softly, tissues being pulled from purses. Pastor Mike stood and led the congregation, thanking God for answered petitions and unexpected miracles, and the way strangers can become family. When the service ended, David didn't leave early for once. He stayed for coffee hour, Emma and Lucas hanging on his arms, Rebecca introducing him to people he'd been avoiding for months. He belonged somewhere again. Finally. Today, Rebecca's organ function remains strong at 85%. She teaches full-time again, leads the Sunday school, takes her kids hiking every weekend. She volunteers at the Transplant Center twice a month, speaking to patients on dialysis, telling them her story, giving them hope. David joins her sometimes at these speaking events, the two of them sitting side by side answering questions about living donation. David still sits in the back row at church, but now it's crowded back there. Rebecca's family has claimed it as their spot. Lucas calls him Uncle David now, shows him every new Pokemon card. Emma asks his advice about math homework and college planning. David attends Emma's volleyball games and Lucas's school plays. When Rebecca's ex-husband Tom hosts family dinners, David is invited. He's woven into their lives in a way that feels both strange and completely natural. The church bulletin still includes requests every Sunday, printed in plain ink on cheap paper, passed over by 100 hands. But people read them more carefully now. They remember Rebecca and David. Sometimes the answer to our deepest needs comes printed in plain black ink on cheap paper, passed over by 100 hands until it reaches the one person meant to respond. Rebecca waited 5 years for an organ, but David waited 3 years for a reason to live again. Both discovered that the deepest healings often happen when strangers become family.